Today's episode of Evergreen Spotlight is a little different. We meet former CNN anchor and journalist Carol Costello. Carol has partnered with Evergreen Podcasts to revisit a story she covered as a 22-year-old novice reporter. In the series, Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. Carol uncovers the brutal attack of Phyllis Cottle, a woman who was savagely assaulted in Akron, Ohio in 1984. Her attacker, Samuel Herring, approached Phyllis on March 4th, 1984 with a knife. She was on her way to work. News reports state she tried to get the attention of people nearby. She honked the horn and screamed, but no one helped. They thought it was a domestic situation. Herring pushed her into the passenger seat and took off, later sexually assaulting her, blinding her, and setting her car on fire. Before being blinded, Phyllis focused on her attacker and gave details that led to a sketch and ultimately helped lead police to Herring. Let's meet Carol to uncover what makes this story so unique. Carol, it's easy to understand how a story like this can stick with you, but I'm curious as to why your attachment to this after so many years.
That's such a good question. Well, as you said, it's an amazing story. It's an amazing story of survival and courage. And I always thought that story needed to be told. Why it took me like 30 years to tell it? That's a more interesting question from my perspective, I suppose. Phyllis Cottle's case was the first big story I ever covered in news professionally. I was really young. I was 22. I was still a senior in college. And I had just suffered a traumatic event while I was in school. So I think that I was looking for someone to tell me that it wasn't my fault. I was looking for that strong voice, that hero, and I found that in Phyllis Cottle. And I guess that made me want to tell her story, but in another way, it also made me loathe to tell it because I would have to dig into my own traumatic event.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope that people get from listening to Blind Rage?
You know, I hope that because there's so many stories of true crime out there that center on the assailant, I hope that it shows people that the survivors in these cases are the true heroes, that they are the names that we should remember, that they are the people we should study. That's ultimately what I want people to take away from this story.
Can you tell us a little bit about Emily Pilfrey's role? She is a former prosecutor who's helping out a bit. I heard her voice on an episode or two so far, but what is her role with you?
Well, I kind of needed somebody who was a legal guide because, I've covered crime a lot through my 35 years in journalism, but I don't really know the ins and outs of prosecuting a case. Or how exactly do police sit down and take a sensational crime like this and start? Where do they begin when there's so much intense pressure from the community for them to solve the case quickly? I needed someone to help me sort through all of that. And Emily was the perfect person. I feel so fortunate that she's part of this podcast.
So there's a unique twist to this story. The man convicted of this crime, Samuel Herring, he's never admitted to his guilt. But then also I'm reading and understanding that he continues to sort of bombard the family with different calls and different forms of communication. Can you maybe talk about where the case stands now?
Well, to this day, Samuel Herring has never admitted guilt. He has always said he was not guilty of this crime. He was guilty of a lot of other crimes, but not this one. In the early days, he used to send Phyllis terrible letters condemning her for testifying against him in court, saying that there was a special place in hell for her, sending an innocent man to prison. He comes up for parole every 10 years or so, and he's never, ever admitted guilt. And to this day, in prison, he says he did not do this, which doesn't mean anything, right? But I don't know. She's blind, obviously, so she can't really identify him by sight. And during the investigation, police didn't have a great eyewitness, somebody who could definitively identify him. So it plants that element of doubt in your mind. On the other hand, it's a very strong circumstantial case, which is another reason why I wanted Emily Pilfrey involved. So I go through all of the ins and outs of that so that, listeners can decide for themselves.
Why do you think Phyllis has so much courage and just like will to live? Like, where do you think that comes from?
God, I asked a psychologist that very question because I don't understand it.
I feel like I'd be so resentful and wanting revenge.
She wanted justice. I don't know if vengeance is the right word, but she wanted justice. I think that when Phyllis was abducted, she was 44 years old, so she had some life experience. I think that she was in other abusive relationships, and I think that at that point, when she was ultimately in a car tied up with the car set on fire, she just said, I got angry, I got pissed off, I was so angry, and I said to myself, he is not going to fry me, I am going to fry him. I think, and this is just my personal opinion, that all of the rage that she kept inside her through all of those years of abuse from other men came to the forefront. And it like boiled inside of her. And I honestly think that's how she found the will to survive, because she didn't pray. She didn't call for help. She just got pissed.
Is there anything leading up to the assault you think that Phyllis could have done differently that could maybe lend as advice for people in the world and, just in general?
Phyllis did all the right things. She screamed, she hit him, she beeped her horn, and no one came to her aid. So I would have to sadly say there wasn't anything that Phyllis could have done to prevent her abduction. There was a big, strong man with a knife who pushed her into the car and threatened her with that knife. There were people, passersby, who saw something, but they said, I think it's a domestic, and they walked on by. But she was screaming help. So it does make you wonder about human nature.
I want to unveil really like how she got away, but I know that you're going to cover that in your podcast. So I would love to just direct our listeners to listen to Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage. And I want to switch gears just a little bit if we can. Carol, we can always come back to this incredible story, but I want to talk about your journey as a podcaster and really how your past as a journalist has basically taken a whole new role. And maybe you can speak about how it's helped you and maybe how it's really propelled this new initiative that you have.
Well, like I said, for about 35 years, I was a working journalist. I spent 20 years at CNN, and I've covered huge stories. But I always felt that since I didn't do documentaries, that I couldn't really get into the nitty-gritty of a story, like a crime story. Certain kinds of crimes, like the crime that happened with Phyllis, there are cultural references that you can look at as reasons as to why this might have happened. Her crime affected a whole community and for a time the whole nation. And why did that happen? How did she suck the air out of the room? How did she seize the control of her own narrative at a time when other victims of sexual assault went into hiding for very good reasons? But that did allow their assailants to get the bulk of news coverage. Like how in 1984 did Phyllis's decision to seize her own narrative affect the wider culture? So that's why I was attracted to podcasting, because I can get into all of that. I can really examine things closely and in depth, because these stories matter on a deeper level. And that's the beautiful thing about podcasting. You can go deep and people want to listen because they're discerning listeners and they're smart and they want to learn from these things too.
How do you focus so much on crime and your history as being reporter and journalist? I know for me, it was tough sometimes to differentiate between, the trauma that you're learning about and reporting about, but then how do you sort of decompress from that? What are some ways that you do that?
Well, I was always a crime reporter. It started when I worked in Akron at TV23 and WAKR. Eventually, I was assigned to be the crime reporter. And I would go down to the police department every day, and I would read through the police reports and establish sources.
Oh my gosh.
And then as I went on with my career through Columbus, and I worked in Indianapolis, in Baltimore. And to some extent, I always covered crime. And there came a point in time when I just couldn't do it anymore, because you're right, it does a number on your brain, on your psyche.
Yeah.
And I also think that in school, they don't really teach you how to deal with that kind of trauma. And they don't really teach you how to effectively interview victims of trauma, which is a sad thing, because if you do something wrong, you feel like crap if you're a human being. And you don't want to hurt the person further either. But ultimately, it all does a number on you too. And you're also not taught to deal with that. And those things, I think, should be taught at the university level.
Which, speaking of, you're now a professor, correct?
I am.
At a university? Yeah.
It's so weird to think
Tell
about.
our listeners where you do that. Why?
Well, I live in Los Angeles now. And when I left CNN around, I think I did 2018. I think that was the year. I just was looking for something else to do. And I decided I would teach journalism. And it just happened to be Loyola Marymount University. And in California, in Los Angeles. And I do enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's very challenging right now because the state of journalism is quite perilous, as you know. But I like to think I'm fighting a good fight and helping to educate journalists who are ethical and trustworthy and will better the profession.
And not be too biased. And what is your advice now for journalists coming up that you see in your school?
Open your mind to others' opinions and points of view. I think we live in a world today where we all like to remain in our own bubble, and we don't feel that we really have to listen to anyone else's point of view, because who cares about them? I mean, there's a certain kind of hatred running through our country right now. My advice would be to don't go there. Good journalists open their minds to other points of view, and they take in information, and they allow the audience, the viewers, the listeners to come to their own conclusions. And that's how it should be. That's not to say you should broadcast lies, because that's not journalism either. But you should gather facts from all points of view and present them in an unbiased way. And that's really hard right now because people expect journalists to be biased. So you kind of have to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, we've sort of have that resentment now, I think, as a society, just listening to different journalists being biased. What kind of challenges have you faced overall in podcasting?
You know, with Phyllis's story, everybody readily agreed to be interviewed. Her family members, the prosecutors, the detective who investigated her case. And I think that's really unusual. But I think it says something about Phyllis, because she was so beloved that people were more than ready to sing her praises and tell her story. I don't think that's the norm, because my first experimental podcast was called I Hate Your Generation. And I wanted to take a look at why, Gen Z hates baby boomers, right? I wanted to get a baby boomer and a Gen Zer and put them together and have them talk about our cultural issues of the day. To get people willing to do that was quite difficult.
Yeah, I was going to say the coordinating of that would be very hard.
Yes. And to keep it all civil was really hard.
Yeah.
But I did learn a lot about, tamping down on the craziness.
So when did you start podcasting?
Oh, let's see. 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Before it was cool, right?
Before it was
2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, just a couple of years ago. Because, I was still working as a journalist all the way up till 2018. So I started to experiment with podcasting about a year or two later. But this podcast is really different because it's 12 parts and it tells a story, which is different from I Hate Your Generation, where I could take, each episode would be completely different and I didn't have to have a thread all the way through.
It's awesome. It's great. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start their own podcast?
Have a story to tell. Do not just sit down and chatter. Because while that works for some people, it does not work for most people. Yeah. I would say you have to have a good story to tell. And then you have to be organized in the way that you tell it. I like to go out and get my own information or augment information that I've gathered through other sources. To me, that enriches the story. It makes it stronger. It makes it your own story that you're telling. That would be my advice. Like, do the work. I think ultimately that's what I'm saying. You have to do the work.
Do that. Yeah.
To create
like lay the ground, like really lay the road ahead almost,
That's
you
right.
know? And I like how you have different sound clips from, you know, the previous police officers. You have Phyllis's voice in there. It's incredible. Yeah, I can definitely, that's great advice for sure. Is there anything I've missed? What else do you want to add? Is there anything that you're really hoping to get across?
You know, I think that, you know, this podcast was a labor of love for me because I just love Phyllis Cottle and I want her story to be heard. I think that there's a level of anxiety that no one will listen after you've put in all this work. And I've come to the conclusion that while I hope many, many thousands of people listen to Phyllis's story, in the end, I don't think it matters because I've done something that I've wanted to do for 30 years. I've told Phyllis's story. I've told her story of courage from her point of view, and that will always make my heart and my soul happy.
It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing her story with us. And as someone who's from Akron, Ohio, it's just incredible to learn more about the city, good and bad. And I can't wait to listen to more of the show. And I just want to say, for those of you listening or watching, visit evergreenpodcast.com and you can find Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage and listen to the whole 12-part series. It's awesome. And you'll fall in love with Phyllis. Carol, thank you so much for being on Evergreen Spotlight.
I so appreciate it. Thank you so much.